What's up, YouTube? Today I'm answering the most frequent question I get asked.
What's your stain technique?
If you have been following me for any amount of time, you know I hate this question. It is a complicated answer. Number one, there's a handful of steps through the whole process. So when somebody sends me a DM or asks me in a comment, I really don't want to have to sit here and type out a 5-step process in the middle of my workday. Number two, not every project gets stained the same. Every single project gets treated a little bit differently when it comes to stain. You can stain two things the exact same way, but depending on the colors that you use in maybe your painting process, or whether a piece has a black border around it or a brown border, a project is going to turn out totally different look. Number three, I think everybody should figure out their own personal stain process. That way they get a good grasp of what they're doing, what they like, how they like doing it, what products they like to use, and really figure it out. Because ultimately, seeing somebody's work online, whether that's a picture or a video or whatever, totally looks different in person, depending on indoor lighting, outdoor lighting, way too much lighting, or darkness. So with that being said, I'm gonna show you guys one of my go-to staining methods. I got this whole piece tooled, painted, ready to go. I am not going to talk about any of my painting. I actually have a full-length video on my whole paint process. You can find that down in the description below. So what we have is a fully dried piece of leather after the wetness from the tooling is dried, after the wetness from the paint is dried. And now we're ready to add in our stains and whatnot. First order business, get on my dirty stain gloves. Then we take our gallon of Neat's Foot oil. I like to use this Neat's Foot compound. It's really pretty. It doesn't darken the leather too much like other Neat's Foot compounds do. Now, for a lot of my pieces, I don't like to stain them that dark. So with that being said, the more oil you use, the darker your leather's gonna get before you even put stain to it. Take a little bit of this oil here and give it a little rub. You'll see that I'm not drowning it personally. Some people like to drown it in oil. I like to give it a nice light coat, just a little something something to give this dried out skin a little bit of hydration. On your painted surfaces, like you can see here, I try not to coat it up too much over the top of the paint because it's not going to absorb through the paint all that well, which is also why I don't like to paint super heavy at times. Only usually like on logos and things, you can see kind of this oil cutting through this green paint. That's because I didn't want this green in the landscape to be just like bright and poppy and vibrant the way that this logo is. You'll even see that happening here throughout the yellow and the sunflowers. I like to dab off any extra oil we have that's sitting on the surface of the paint and kind of compromise the bond between the paint and the leather a little bit. But you can see where the oil went into the leather, it is nice and absorbed into the surface already. You can see a little bit of that glossiness in the paint, especially like on this cow here. That oil is still kind of puddled up. So we're gonna go put this outside and let it dry for a little bit. Today, luckily it's super hot, so we probably only will need 15-20 minutes tops. On a cold, rainy, or highly humid day, it might need more like 30 minutes to an hour. See you guys in 15 minutes. Now you can see the leather has lightened up a little bit since last time. I could wait a little bit longer. I mean, I could wait 24 hours and this would lighten up a little bit more, but it doesn't matter that much. Personally, this is the kind of the way I do it. This is my routine. I know what to expect out of it, out of this color. This is why I think it's the most important to figure out your own process, because I can't personally explain or telekinetically put the knowledge of how stuff is going to turn out and all the little micro nuances after doing this for almost 10 years now. The next step is to put some resist coat on. Some people like to use tan coat. Some people like to use that gum tragacanth or whatever the hell it's called. I personally am a good old-fashioned Resolene boy. What resist does is it's effectively a clear coat that will help protect the surface of the leather so that when I go to stain the leather, like hypothetically, let's say I use a dark brown, it won't turn the leather dark brown. What happens is this Resolene creates a little bit of a barrier so that when I rub some antique over the surface of it, these higher parts of the design you know, such as, you know, this kind of flat surface here, you know, the little ball of this loop here, this kind of, you know, loop here, and all these high spots we have throughout our tooling. You know, all these little lines, there's some high spots and some low spots because tooling has dimension. When you use a resist, it helps keep the highest parts of the surface of the leather protected from turning super dark. And then that allows your antique to pool up in the lower spots. You're gonna see these little chunks of background really pop out and give our tooling a ton of dimension. So we're gonna take our Resolene and our cheap 1-inch paintbrush. Shout out to Harbor Freight. You can get a box of like 50 of these things for like $3. Highly recommend them. I use them probably 4 or 5 times, and then I toss them because they get super hard. These resist coats really remind me of like a super watered down Elmer's glue. If you use it a bunch, this actually hardens up pretty aggressively. This one's about halfway through its life. You can see, you know, here, compared to a completely fresh one, this, you know, still has all the bristles and stuff, but this is just an applicator. The point is, it's just to get the liquid on the surface of the leather. Now, people, when they message me, they usually go like, I use a resist and it always turns out really shitty. Most of the time, I'll tell you right now, you're not putting enough resist coat on it. There's 2 things that can be happening. One, you're not putting enough, which is most likely what's happening. As you can see, I'm like literally letting it pool up here. And that's the trick. You kind of gotta let it pool up on the surface of the leather, because what's gonna happen when you pull it up like this, the leather is only gonna absorb so much down into that surface. And basically, once we have it fully applied, we're gonna let it soak in a little bit and we're gonna dab off the excess. What you wanna do is make sure that it's coated up enough, the leather will absorb basically as much as it's going to, kind of in like a, kind of like terminal velocity, but in the absorption of liquids into the surface of a leather, if that makes any sense. Okay, you can see I got a nice full coat. You can see these high spots in this tooling, you know, the liquid is fully absorbed there. So what we need to do is very gently kind of keep brushing and massaging the surface of the leather, making sure that we have a really nice, aggressive, solid coat. If you are not resist coating like this and you're still having problems, give this a try and thank me later. I know personally this was my biggest problem with, once I tried and switched over to using a resist coat, this was my biggest problem, not putting enough on here. Especially if you're a beginner crafter, you're like, man, this is just like expensive for no reason. And it's like, sure it is, but if you buy a gallon, it's pretty cheap. You know, this is maybe 10, 15 cents worth of resist coat, and I can guarantee that this is enough and this will make my project look really good. I'm going to try not to speed this up in, you know, when I edit the video so you guys can see realistically how much time has passed to let this absorb. So now we're just gonna take a clean rag, sit there. I don't like to dab it a whole lot. I would much rather prefer just come in, put really good pressure. This stuff, because it has kind of like, once it starts drying, has a jelly texture. Like I said, very similar to a super watered down Elmer's glue. Just like back in school, like look, I don't know if you'll be able to see it on my fingers, but I have a little bit on my fingers. If I sit here, rub my fingers together, we'll get these kind of like, you know, glue looking boogers, you know? So what we're gonna do now is let this dry. But before I go and let this dry and take off, this is another portion of the process that people mess up. You can do 2 things when you're using a resist coat. If I wanted to, I could stain this right now and nothing would be wrong. It would end up a little bit darker than if I were to let it dry, but I like to let it dry and really let this leather lighten up and really cure this coating here. But the biggest mistake people make with a resist coat is basically cutting those 2 options down the middle. When it's all wet like this, it's fine because the whole surface is wet and consistently wet, right? And then if we let it cure and completely dry, it'll be fully cured and completely dry. If you cut down the middle and let's say half of it's drying, what that will do is give you a super blotchy, weird kind of look that's really hard to describe. The only really way to describe it or to know what I'm talking about is to have made this mistake yourself. So with that being said, I'm guessing we're gonna come back to this in 2 to 3 hours and actually put some stain on this thing. Here we have it. So doesn't look too crazy, right? Kind of looks pretty similar to how it looked right after I oiled it. But now is time for the magic and to actually get some stain on this bad boy. Okay, so what we'll need: 1 glove, 2 gloves, the toothbrush I brush my teeth with, and some stain. So I use a Gel Antique. I'm a big fan of the Fiebings. On this particular project, I'm going to use dark brown. But like I said in the beginning also, knowing what your customer wants, how you have your, vision for this piece that you're creating, if you wanna take the approach as an artist, you gotta have all this kind of creative stuff happening in your mind, before you go into it. I also use the tan, as well as the medium brown pretty often, and the occasional mahogany and Sheridan brown. Also, I will get a rag as well as one of these blue shop towels. Some projects I'll wipe with the rag, some projects I'll wipe with the shop towel. I keep both of them on hand, kind of let it speak to me as it's going. These gloves make me look like the prostate examiner from hell, but I like to reuse them. I take them on and off. This is the second time I've had to put these gloves back on just on this piece alone, let alone however many pieces I'm working with that specific day. We're getting low, but here you can see it. This Gel Antique paste. What I'll do is get a glob about this size. This should do most of it, but if I need to get a little bit more, I'll just grab a little bit more. There's nothing fancy. You just start rubbing it in. I love using a toothbrush or a brush of any kind to do the stain, because this really allows you to get down in the cracks of your tooling. One of my strong suits, I feel like, as a leather crafter, or at least even a leather, tooler or carver, is that I feel like my tooling has a great amount of depth. It's definitely one of my strong points. So with this extreme depth that we have, we really need to get down in those cracks. No crazy fancy technique, kind of go one way and kind of go the other way. You want to make sure around your, your vines and stuff, you're kind of brushing along with the vines so you can get down in the cracks and the different complex shapes of all the vines. You want to sit here for 10 hours and scrub it, and damage the surface of the leather, but you just get in there. I really just focus on getting things in the cracks, and then everything else kind of in the middle just kind of falls into place. Now we have this terrible looking mess. All I'm gonna do, take my towel and wipe it. Now what we're doing here is getting a bulk of the stain off. It's not entirely done. This is gonna give us a good idea of what it's gonna look like. I will say right at the moment, it's a little bit darker. We need to keep working on getting some of this excess stain off. I do not like how dark this portion of this sunflower is really. And then this in here looks pretty muddy as well. Your rag will tend to flatten itself out like this, and then these fibers don't really get down in those cracks. So we'll hit it with a new fresh part of the rag so these fibers can, do their job and get down into those lower places. Oh yeah, there it is. Did you see that? I hope that picked up on the camera as much as it did in real life, but that definitely lightened up this little chunk of floral here. Rub a tiny bit more on the sunflowers. So what we're gonna do now is let this dry for about 10 or 15 minutes and then move on to the next step. So we're pretty close to being done. So what we're gonna do now is get this little bottle of Resolene again on this blue rag here. And what we're gonna do now is buff off any of the excess stain we have on the surface. This step is gonna be kind of hard to see on the camera. I got my fingers crossed. I think this should be fine. But basically what this is gonna do, just like last time how we went and we wiped off all the excess stain from the top, this is gonna do that basically again, just a little bit better. It's also gonna add a little bit of a glossy finish to this. It's not gonna be like crazy high gloss or anything. What we're about to do right now is going to be basically the final step in the actual staining process. Give us a nice little protective coat at the end here, as well as continue to give us that really high contrast that we're looking for. You can see it right there on this brand. That definitely popped. You could also see the gloss really well on the borders. Not gonna lie, I don't know if you'll be able to see the difference on the camera, but you could kind of take a look at this portion of floral compared to this portion of floral. This one looks a little bit muddier. This one looks a little bit cleaner. You can see up here, this piece looks really clean in comparison to the muddiness. Like this little chunk right here looks way cleaner than this, you know, chunk of floral over here. I do think this side is a little bit muddier, so like let's hopefully get a good shot of that changing. This chunk up top, this should change quite a bit. Definitely keep an eye out for her pants here and the sky. You're gonna see the biggest change, I think, on the camera. Like I said, this is really difficult to see through cameras. Every time I film this process, it's really tricky to get a good visual on it. But let's look at her pants. That white on those pants really start to pop here. We'll do the sky portion. Yeah, there we go. See how bright that sky looks now? But that was technically my stain process, but we're really close to being finished with this. So I'm gonna zip this together really quick for you guys, and we will take a closer look once it's fully done.